Hey ladies and gentlemen, Krzysztof the Polish Geek, and as promised, I have a review for you of the old Haunted Mansion movie, the 2003 one, and you already know my experience with Haunted Mansion ride, and you probably already know I'm far more familiar with the Phantom Manor version from the Disneyland Paris. So now I will review the 2003 movie, the movie that's not really considered good by most people, and especially fans of the original ride, because objectively, in some ways the movie isn't quite very faithful to the ride. We'll get that later, but I remember I watched the movie first in like 2003 when it came out on VHS with a good friend of mine. He came to my house and we saw the movie on VHS together, and we actually enjoyed it, but the movie isn't really considered that good. And honestly, with time, I wasn't a huge fan of it either. But right before the new movie, I decided to give a movie another watch to see if is it really as bad as you remember it. And the answer is no, I don't think so. I don't think it's that bad of a movie. It's not a particularly great movie. It's not even a particularly good movie either, but I don't think it's bad. I would say it's like a little above average. Like, it's pretty cheesy like the new one, but, well, sometimes sometimes cheesy doesn't mean bad, and this is a perfect example just like the new movie. So, let's compare this movie and the new movie a little bit. The story of this movie is actually pretty simple. It's that real estate agents, Jim Evers and his wife Sarah Evers, and their kids hear the news that someone wants to sell an old rich mansion. Like, they don't know the mansion is haunted, so they go to the mansion in order to help the owner sell it, and then they learn that the owner, Edward Gracie, that he believes that Sarah Evers is actually a reincarnation of his fiancée, Elizabeth Henshaw, who committed suicide long ago in the past, and he believes she's her reincarnated, and that's why he really wanted her and not the family. And the very beginning of the movie actually tells the whole story of Edward Gracie and Elizabeth in the flashback, and this I think is a very well done scene. It's kind of creepy, and the creepy music kind of matches it, and I think it's a very nice way to set up a story. So yes, the first flashback sequence I think is a very, very good and well done sequence. And then when it comes to story though, here is the problem that lots of fans of the original ride have a problem with, because in the original ride, the idea is that afterlife is fun, and that the ghosts don't really want to move on to afterlife, they just enjoy having a party in the mansion as ghosts. While in this movie, that's very much the whole point, that the ghosts very much want to move on, but they cannot until Master Gracie's happiness comes back. So yes, it's not exactly quite faithful to the spirit of the original attraction. But then again, I personally never had a problem with that really, because, let's face it, I think the idea of ghosts having a party and enjoying afterlife, I think it's a much better fit for a haunted house attraction than it is for a movie. For a movie, you need a story and not just a bunch of ghosts dancing and having fun. So, when it comes to faithfulness of the ride, this movie, I wouldn't say is very faithful. I mean, it certainly has the vibes of the original ride. Like, I remember I experienced Phantom Manor actually as when I was only like 6 years old. Yeah, that's right, I experienced it when I was like 6 years old, and then I watched this movie when I was like 9. And I remember I was actually getting huge vibes of Phantom Manor ride, even though the movie was technically based on the original Haunted Mansion. But because Phantom Manor is technically Paris' version of Haunted Mansion, I did get huge Phantom Manor vibes from this movie. Well, so no wonder it was technically based on Haunted Mansion, because I later learned, like a few years later, that those vibes were not coincidental, quite the opposite. They were actually, because technically, as I said, the movie was based on Haunted Mansion. When it comes to the story, It's hard to say which one really is better, the new one or the old one. I don't think either one of those movies has a very bad story. I don't think either one has a particularly great story either, but I did had a pretty entertaining time as I was watching both movies and their stories. So when it comes to story, I say both of those movies are about equal. And then ultimately the characters. Like, I say this one has slight edge when it comes to the characters because I actually felt more connected to the Evers family than I did to the most of the characters in the new movie. Like, most of the characters in the new movie, were pretty bland. Like, I liked Travis, and I liked the Father Ken the priest, and I really liked the tour guide, but other characters, I felt like were somewhat bland. While in this movie, I very much felt connected to the Evers family, and I was really wondering what would happen to them. And I did care about Master Gracie as well. But then again, admittedly, this movie also has a much smaller quantity of characters. So I guess that could somewhat explain that I cared more about the characters in this movie, because this movie admittedly had a much smaller cast of characters than the new movie. And when it comes to scary factor, it's hard really to say which one of those movies is scarier, because in all honesty, I have to be honest, I don't think either one of those two movies is particularly scary, sadly. It's based on the Haunted Mansion, and it technically should be scary, but that's, I think, the major problem with both of those movies. I unfortunately don't think either one of them is particularly scary. I guess I'll give a credit to this one for being slightly more scary, considering that I think the story of this one is a little darker, even though this one is PG and the new one is PG-13, but I personally think this one has a slightly darker story, but ultimately, I don't think either one of those two movies is particularly scary. So ultimately, when it comes to scariness, none of those movies win. When it comes to the story, I say they're tied up. And when it comes to the characters, I say 2003 movie wins. And when it comes to Faithfulness of the Ride, the new one all the way, because the new one is filled with Easter eggs, the ride, and even the theme that goes enjoy afterlife as opposed of trying to move on like they did in the movie I'm reviewing, is definitely the idea of the ride. And that was actually one of the major criticisms of this movie here, that this movie is very much about ghosts wanting to move on onto afterlife, while that's certainly not the idea of the ride. But for me at least, that's not really a problem, because again, I'm not the type of guy that always really cares particularly about faithfulness to the source material. I'm one of those people that, as I don't really care about faithfulness to the source material, I just want a good story with good characters. So ultimately, 2003 Haunted Mansion, I don't think it's as bad as people make it out to be. I think it's better than you remember. But that said, it's still not a particularly great movie. I wouldn't even call it a pretty good movie. I would call it a decent, enjoyable horror comedy flick. Yeah, if you want to call it. Same way basically what I would say about the new one. Both of those movies are just decent, entertaining flicks that you can enjoy, but neither one of those two movies is particularly a great movie. So these are my thoughts on 2003 Haunted Mansion. And last thing I will mention, which I forgot about, I think Eddie Murphy as Jim Evers is pretty good. I think Eddie Murphy does a very good job in the role of Jim Evers. And yeah, so ultimately, that's how I feel about the 2003 Haunted Mansion. I don't think it's worse than the new one, like some people were saying it is. I think that both of those movies are pretty comparable to each other, and neither one of them is a particularly great movie. But neither one of them is really that bad either. They are pretty enjoyable. So yeah, and press the like button, please subscribe to this channel, and I will talk to you soon in another video. Talk to you later, bye!